Keynesian economics explained, the idea that keeps returning when the world breaks. Why Keynesian economics still runs the world, even when politicians pretend it doesn't. From the Great Depression to the inflation shocks, Keynes's central insight still frames how governments, central banks and markets respond when growth falters, debt rises and the world economy turns dangerous. Keynes never really left, he just stopped being named. If you want to understand the modern world economy, you have to begin with a slightly uncomfortable truth. Most major governments still behave like Keynesians when things get worse. They may not always use the label. They may talk instead about resilience, macro stability, demand support, targeted relief, or safeguarding the transmission mechanism. But when recession hits, private spending collapses, credit tightens, and fear spreads, the state steps in. That basic reflex is Keynesian. It is the operating logic behind stimulus packages, automatic stabilizers, emergency liquidity, bond buying programs, and the idea that mass unemployment is not something a healthy society should simply wait out. And that matters right now because the world economy in April 2026 is not calm enough to let theory stay theoretical. The IMF's latest World Economic Outlook puts global growth at 3.1% for 2026 and 3.2% for 2027 under its reference forecast, while warning that inflation will rise to 4.4% in 2026 before easing in 2027. The OECD's March 2026 outlook is slightly weaker on growth, projecting 2.9% in 2026 and 3% in 2027. And it also warns that higher energy prices are prolonging inflation. In other words, the world economy is still growing, but uncomfortably, and policymakers cannot relax. That is precisely the kind of environment in which Keynesian economics becomes unavoidable. Not because it solves everything, not because it is fashionable, but modern economies are too financialized, too interconnected, too politically fragile, and too socially exposed to treat mass demand failure as a cleansing event. When households stop spending, firms stop investing, banks pull back, and unemployment rises, governments do not stand aside for very long. They intervene, sometimes clumsily, sometimes too late, sometimes too much, but they intervene. So what exactly is Keynesian economics? Why did it become so powerful? Why did it seem discredited at various moments? And why, despite decades of attacks from free market purists, does it still shape how the modern world economy is actually run? Keynes's big idea was not spend more. It was that demand can fail. John Maynard Keynes wrote in The Shadow of the Great Depression, when the old belief that markets would naturally self-correct into full employment looked less like wisdom and more like denial. In 1936, the general theory of employment, interest and money helped overturn the classical idea that wage flexibility and market adjustments would reliably restore equilibrium. Keynes argued instead that aggregate demand, the total spending of households, businesses and government, drives output and employment, and that weak demand can trap an economy in prolonged underperformance. That was the real break. Keynes was not merely saying that recessions hurt. Plenty of people already knew that. He was saying something sharper. A capitalist economy could settle into a negative equilibrium with high unemployment not because workers suddenly forgot how to work or firms forgot how to produce, but because total spending had fallen too far. If enough people and businesses become cautious at the same time, their individually rational behavior becomes collectively destructive. My cut in spending becomes your lost income. Your lost income becomes someone else's cancelled order. Someone else's cancelled order becomes another worker's redundancy. The economy contracts not because supply has vanished, but because demand has. This scenario is why Keynesian economics is often misunderstood by both admirers and critics. Its core claim is that government spending is not always good, deficits matter, and markets are wiser than the state in some domains. The core claim is narrower and more powerful. In downturns, private economies can fail to generate enough demand to employ their available labor and capital, and government action can sometimes stop that failure from feeding on itself. That sounds almost obvious now. It did not sound obvious when Keynes wrote it. Modern macroeconomics, central banking, and fiscal policy have evolved in the aftermath of that argument, making it sound obvious. the machinery of Keynesian economics: demand, stickiness, the multiplier, and the trap. 4 ideas sit at the heart of Keynesian thinking. First, aggregate demand matters. Consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports together determine the pace of economic activity. When those components weaken together, the economy slows. Second, prices and wages do not always adjust fast enough to restore balance. The IMF's own explainer summarizes this bluntly. Prices, especially wages, respond slowly, and changes in aggregate demand have their biggest short-run effect on output and employment, rather than immediately on prices. That matters because it means recessions do not instantly heal themselves through elegant price adjustment. Jobs disappear first. Third, the multiplier exists. If government spending rises in a slack economy, the effect can be larger than the initial outlay because one person's spending becomes another person's income, which supports further spending. The IMF notes that in Keynesian models, output can change by some multiple of the original shock. If the fiscal multiplier is above 1%, $1 of government spending raises output by more than $1. That is a well-known and debated macroeconomic idea, but it is still key to crisis policy making. Fourth, monetary policy can lose traction in extreme weakness. Keynes's liquidity trap idea was that when rates are already very low, cutting them further may not do much to revive investment and employment. The ECB's current inflation strategy still explicitly acknowledges the lower bound problem. When nominal rates are near their lower bound, especially forceful or persistent action may be needed to prevent inflation from remaining too low. That is a modern institutional echo of a very Keynesian insight. Put those together and you get the broad Keynesian policy map. In a slump, governments can spend more, tax less, or let automatic stabilizers work. Central banks can cut rates, ease credit conditions, and if necessary buy assets to lower longer-term borrowing costs. The point is not abstract ideological activism. The point is to stop a fall in demand from turning into a deeper collapse in incomes, jobs, and confidence. Keynesian policy in the real world is bigger than stimulus checks. When people hear Keynesian economics, they often picture a government announcing a giant spending package. That is only part of the story. A large part of Keynesianism in practice is automatic rather than dramatic. The IMF defines automatic stabilizers as taxes and transfers that respond automatically to changes in output and employment. When growth slows, tax receipts fall and unemployment-related transfers rise, cushioning household incomes without requiring a fresh vote in Parliament every time trouble begins. These stabilizers are boring compared with emergency summits and trillion-dollar headlines, but they are often the first line of defense in a downturn. Another part is monetary. The Federal Reserve's mandate is to promote maximum employment and stable prices, with 2% inflation treated as consistent with that goal. The Bank of England's job is to keep inflation at 2% over the medium term, while also supporting broader economic aims subject to that primary objective. The ECB similarly targets 2% inflation across the euro area and explicitly explains that both too high and too low inflation are undesirable. None of these frameworks is textbook 1930s Keynesianism, but each reflects the modern macro consensus that aggregate demand management matters, that unemployment is not a trivial side issue, and that stabilization policy is a central function of the state. That is a Keynesian inheritance, even where the institutional language is more technocratic. Then there is quantitative easing. The Bank of England states plainly that QE lowers long-term borrowing costs to support spending and help meet the inflation target. It first used QE in March 2009, when bank rate was already very low after the global financial crisis, and it ultimately bought £895 billion of bonds. That is not laissez-faire. It is a central bank deliberately intervening in financial markets to alter broad economic conditions because conventional rate cuts had reached their limit. So when people say Keynesian economics is outdated, they usually mean something narrower, that crude pump priming alone is not enough, or that endless deficits create new dangers, or that inflation changes the calculus. Those are serious arguments, but they do not mean that Keynesian ideas disappeared. They did not. They were built into the institutions that govern modern capitalism. Why Keynes came roaring back after 2008. For much of the late 20th century, the political mood in many advanced economies shifted against explicit Keynesianism. Monetarism, deregulation, privatization, and faith in rules over discretion all gained ground. Inflation in the 1970s had badly damaged the reputation of simplistic demand management. By the 1980s and 1990s, the dominant settlement was less the state will fine-tune everything and more keep inflation credible, liberalize markets, and let central banks do most of the stabilization. Then, the financial crisis hit. After 2008, rich economies rediscovered something Keynes had understood all along. When private balance sheets are damaged, banks are frightened, and confidence collapses, the private sector does not automatically self-rescue. Credit dries up. Investment freezes. Households save defensively. Demand falls. This is when the state re-emerges, not as an optional addition, but as the primary spender, lender, guarantor, and last resort balance sheet backstop. The United States used fiscal stimulus through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, while the Federal Reserve slashed rates and expanded its balance sheet. The Congressional Budget Office later concluded that ARA still raised GDP and employment even in 2014, years after enactment, though by then the effect had become much smaller. In the UK, the Bank of England used QE because rates were already too low to do enough on their own. Across advanced economies, the lesson was clear. Once the private engine stalls hard enough, public action becomes the bridge. This was the period in which Keynesian language softened and Keynesian practice hardened. Governments did not always call what they were doing Keynesian. Sometimes they called it stabilization, rescue, support for confidence, or preserving the transmission mechanism. But the logic was the same. Demand had fallen too far. Financial stress was amplifying the contraction, and waiting for spontaneous repair was too dangerous. COVID was the biggest Keynesian experiment of the modern age. If the post-2008 response revived Keynesianism, the pandemic exploded it in plain sight. The IMF's April 2020 World Economic Outlook projected that the global economy would contract by 3% in 2020, worse than during the 2008-09 financial crisis, and argued that substantial targeted fiscal, monetary and financial measures were essential to support households and businesses. By January 2021, the IMF estimated that global fiscal support had reached $14 trillion, helping save lives and livelihoods while also pushing public debt sharply higher. That was Keynesianism under emergency conditions. Governments paid wages, underwrote firms, extended credit guarantees, increased transfers, delayed taxes, and expanded health spending. Central banks cut rates, bought assets, and acted to stop financial markets from seizing up. None of that happened because the world suddenly became socialist. It happened because, in a severe shock, modern economies are too interconnected to allow cascading collapse. This is the point many ideological arguments still miss. Keynesian economics is not primarily a moral vision. It is a crisis management framework. It starts with the observation that capitalist economies are vulnerable to demand shortfalls, panic, and self-reinforcing contractions. During COVID, that framework went from theory to operating system in a matter of weeks. The question was never whether governments would intervene. The question was how much, how fast, through which channels, and with what consequences later. And those later consequences matter, because they explain why the Keynesian debate changed again after 2021. Inflation changed the argument, but it did not erase Keynes. One reason Keynesian economics is so often attacked is that people confuse it with a one-way ratchet of permanent stimulus. In reality, Keynes himself argued for counter-cyclical policy. Governments should support demand in downturns and lean against overheating in booms. The IMF's explainer is explicit on this point. Keynesian economists would use deficit spending in downturns, but would also raise taxes or restrain demand when economies overheat. The theory was never meant to be spent regardless of conditions. That distinction became crucial in the inflationary aftermath of the pandemic. When supply chains were strained, energy prices surged, labor markets tightened, and reopening demand collided with restricted supply. The old slump logic, no longer cleanly applied. The ECB's transmission framework states the problem directly. When demand exceeds supply, upward price pressure is likely to occur. In that environment, additional broad-based stimulus can worsen inflation rather than mainly raise real output. This is where the critics of crude Keynesianism have a real point. Demand management works differently depending on whether the economy has idle capacity or hard supply constraints. Stimulus in a depressed economy with spare labor and weak credit is one thing. A stimulus into an economy already constrained by energy, logistics, or labor shortages is another. That is not a rejection of Keynesian economics. It is precisely the kind of context sensitivity serious Keynesians are supposed to recognize. The 1970s remain the classic warning. The Federal Reserve's own history of the Great Inflation notes that the stable trade-off policymakers hoped to exploit between inflation and unemployment proved unstable. By 1974, inflation was above 12% and unemployment was above 7%. By the summer of 1980, inflation was near 14.5% and unemployment was over 7.5%. That was the era of stagflation, when policymakers discovered the brutal limits of trying to maintain demand in the face of inflationary pressures and shifting expectations. That experience still haunts policy today. It is one reason central banks care so much about inflation expectations. It is one reason the ECB stresses that both positive and negative deviations from 2% are undesirable. It is one reason the Bank of England says inflation that is too high or too volatile makes planning harder for households and firms. Keynesianism survived stagflation, but only by becoming more disciplined about inflation, expectations, and credibility. What media misses? The lazy public argument usually presents a false binary. Either free markets run everything, or the government interferes. That is not how the modern world economy actually works. The real system is a hybrid. In normal times, private firms allocate most investment, employment, and production. In abnormal times, the state stabilizes the system beneath them. Central banks target inflation, and, in the Fed's case, employment too. Governments run tax and transfer systems that automatically cushion shocks. Financial authorities backstop banks and liquidity. In severe crises, states borrow, spend, guarantee, and buy assets because the alternative is disorder. That is not full Keynesian command. It is not pure free market self-correction either. It is a mixed economy with Keynesian shock absorbers built into its core. That last sentence is an inference from how today's institutions are designed and behave. The deeper reason Keynes still matters is that modern governments cannot politically or socially tolerate the kind of unemployment spirals that older theories treated with more fatalism. A mass demand collapse is not just an output problem now. It is a banking problem, a welfare problem, a legitimacy problem, and often an electoral problem. The bigger and more interconnected the economy becomes, the more expensive non-intervention becomes. That is why Keynesianism keeps coming back. It does not come back because economists are sentimental about old books. It comes back because severe downturns keep proving that private economies can fail in coordinated ways, and democratic states keep proving they will not simply watch that happen. Why the modern world is becoming more selective, not less Keynesian. The world economy of 2026 is not returning to the easy version of crisis-era stimulus. Debt is high. The IMF says global public debt rose to just under 94% of GDP in 2025 and is set to reach 100% by 2029, 1 year earlier than previously projected. Public finances are under pressure from social spending, defense, strategic autonomy, and higher interest burdens. That means the space for giant untargeted support is narrower than it looked when interest rates were near zero and inflation was too low. The OECD is blunt about the policy implications. In the face of renewed energy shocks, any support should be temporary and well targeted to those most in need, while preserving incentives to reduce energy use. Broad-based subsidies, tax reductions, transfers, and price caps are easier to deploy quickly, but they weaken incentives and come with higher fiscal costs. IMF officials are saying the same thing in current briefings. Support, if needed, should be temporary, targeted, and consistent with fiscal frameworks and debt sustainability. This is the modern form of Keynesianism, not indiscriminate spending, but conditional, temporary, better-aimed intervention. Call it disciplined Keynesianism, post-inflation Keynesianism, or simply grown-up macro policy. The state still intervenes. It just has to do so with more attention to supply constraints, inflation persistence, market credibility, and debt sustainability than many policymakers showed during the ultra-low rate era. In practical terms, that means modern Keynesian policy is more likely to favor targeted cash support over universal subsidies, automatic stabilizers over permanent giveaways, public investment over pure consumption boosts, and temporary relief over structurally open-ended promises. It also means more emphasis on measures that expand supply, energy security, grid investment, transport, housing, skills, because supply-side weakness can make demand support much less effective and much more inflationary. So is Keynesian economics still right? Yes. On its central insight, no. If turned into a lazy excuse for permanent deficit politics, Keynes was right that economies can suffer from a chronic shortage of demand. He was right that mass unemployment can persist without active policy. He was right that waiting for an automatic return to full employment can impose catastrophic human and economic costs. He was right that in deep slumps, public action can stabilize the system when the private sector retreats. The modern architecture of fiscal and monetary policy still reflects those truths. But Keynesian economics becomes dangerous when simplified into the idea that more spending is always the answer, or that inflation is a secondary nuisance, or that debt dynamics can be ignored indefinitely because growth will magically outrun them. The history of the 1970s, the discipline of inflation targeting, and the IMF's current warnings on debt all exist for a reason. Demand management is powerful, but it is not a blank check. The best way to understand Keynes in the modern world is not as a prophet of endless stimulus, but as the thinker who explained why capitalist economies need stabilization tools. Those tools can be overused, they can be mistimed, they can be politically abused. But without them, modern economies become far more fragile, and democratic societies far more combustible. What happens next? The next phase of the debate is unlikely to be Keynes versus the market in the old ideological sense. It is more likely to be a fight over what kind of Keynesianism survives in an era of inflation risk, geopolitical fragmentation, aging populations, defense burdens, and energy transition. The most likely path is a more selective model. Tighter money when inflation flares, targeted fiscal relief instead of universal support, automatic stabilizers left intact, more public investment in capacity, energy, and resilience, and much harsher scrutiny of structural deficits. That is already visible in the guidance coming from the IMF and OECD, both of which are urging targeted, temporary support and stronger medium-term fiscal discipline. The most dangerous path is the opposite one. Governments responding to every shock with broad, debt-funded support, while central banks struggle to re-anchor inflation. In a world where growth is mediocre, debt is high, and supply shocks can return quickly, that mix could recreate the worst features of both eras, post-crisis dependency on intervention and 1970s to style inflation stress. The IMF's downside scenarios for 2026 already show how sensitive the global economy remains to energy disruption, with growth falling as low as 2.5% or even around 2% under more severe scenarios, while inflation climbs further. The most underestimated path is that governments will use Keynesian logic less for short-term stimulus alone and more for strategic restructuring. Industrial policy, green investment, grid expansion, transport upgrades, health resilience, and supply chain security all sit at the border between macro stabilization and long-run statecraft. They are not classic pump priming in the narrow sense, but they reflect the same underlying conviction that markets do not always deliver the socially optimal path on their own, especially under uncertainty and coordination failure. That, too, is part of Keynes's long shadow. The real lesson. Keynesian economics is not the whole truth about the modern world economy. Supply matters. Incentives matter. Productivity matters. Expectations matter. Debt matters. Inflation matters. Politics matters. But Keynes gave modern economics one of its most important permanent corrections. The economy is not just a machine of supply. It is also a system of spending, confidence, and coordination. When those break down, the consequences are not self-healing abstractions. They are layoffs, bankruptcies, wage loss, social anger, political radicalization, and sometimes systemic crisis. That is why, nearly a century after the general theory, governments still reach for Keynesian tools whenever the floor starts giving way. So the cleanest way to explain Keynesian economics is this. It is the reason modern states believe they have a duty to stop recessions from becoming depressions, while also knowing that too much support, badly timed, can fuel inflation and debt trouble of its own. That tension between rescue and restraint is not a sign Keynes failed. It is the reason he still matters.